When your life is in a million pieces, it makes sense to cut up perfectly good fabric and put it back together again. When I heard this quote earlier this year, it struck a chord. I'm still grieving the loss of my beloved grandmother, so I decided to turn grief into a gift and make my first quilt. The challenge of learning something new seems like the perfect way to break away from the overwhelm of grief, yet still leave space for it. I've never made one, but I have thought about it extensively, and I have the Pinterest boards to prove it. Today is the day I have everything I need, I think. I've done two things. I chose the pattern that I want to use, or the block, which is going to be a sawtooth block, and I have the fabrics. My head still hurts from doing all the math that I did for a trial block, a test block, with some scrap fabric that I had. I'm a metrics girly, and switching between metrics and imperial, it was not easy. So what I did, the rulers that I have, the OmniGrid rulers that I have, are all in centimeters, but I did want to invest in a couple of new rulers, so I got one of these, which, even though it's in inches, I think I'll be able to use it for regular centimeter projects, because then I can square fabric a little bit more easily. I know it might sound over the top when I haven't even done my first quilt, but I already know I want to make a couple of quilts. A lot of the times I think about it quite a while, and then it's a good choice. So I'm hoping it's a good choice to buy this one. I have a smaller one also, two smaller ones. Yeah, I might have gone overboard a little bit. So I did the test piece. I'm pretty happy with it. Like everything in the block lines up nicely. What 20 years of sewing taught me is that I can sew straight, but that 1/4 inch seam, I'm sure it's going to be a little bit tricky, but I'm not going to do a ton of blocks. I'm going to make a baby quilt, which is about 120 by 120 centimeters. I think that's like 48 inches. Yeah, I think so. So the colors are going to be quite wild, but it's for a baby, and I recently learned he loves orange. So I jumped at the opportunity to look for some bright colors, and I'm hoping it's just going to be a very bright and playful quilt. I love the idea of doing a scrappy quilt, but I don't have enough coordinating scraps. I'm using some fabrics from my stash, and I bought some new fabrics to coordinate with those. It sort of feels weird buying new fabric and then cutting it up, but I recently heard a quote about when your life is in pieces, it makes sense to cut up the fabric and then put it together again and quilt it. And I think that hits home for me right now, because we just had a loss in my family, and I don't know, grief is a strange thing. Like, you can feel fine 1 second and then just this sadness that washes over you. So I don't know. Immersing myself in a project like this, I think it's a good idea, and I look forward to sort of the puzzle and the challenge that is a quilt. It's easy to procrastinate and get stuck in the research stage, at least it is for me. So to gain some momentum, I cut up an old bed sheet so that I could refine the size and also figure out the process. Then I turned my camera to check if there was enough contrast between the colors. I did that by turning my camera to black and white, and then I could see I needed to adjust just a little bit. Then I divided the fabric into piles, combining darker fabrics with the lighter ones. And I was also looking for nice color and print combinations so that I could use those later as a reference. I want to combine these with these colors. I think there's going to be enough contrast between the two. So these are going to be sort of the lighter ones and these the darker colors. And the same for the greens, or the chicken print. I think I want to combine these two for the stars. So these are going to be the lighter and these are going to be the darker ones. And I'm hoping it's going to be enough contrast. So I would end up with either light stars on a dark background or dark stars on a light background. Yesterday I took the time to make another block in the right size because I hadn't really done that. I made just a test block in a bigger size just to try out how that looked. I already decided sort of on paper that I would do a smaller one. And when I say on paper, I mean I made an Excel sheet. Of course, it's for personal use, so it's a little bit of a mix between centimeters and inches and English and Dutch. To try and figure out how it works and how I could use the new rulers that I have, I did another test block and it turned out all right. Certainly not perfect, but I'm really not aiming for perfection here. I just want the process to be sort of a fun puzzle. I think so far that is the case, but enough trying and testing. I'm going to cut into the actual fabric and make my first block. I'm not going to try and cut everything and then make all the blocks at once because I'll probably need to adjust along the way. I'm going to do it a block at a time, and I'm sort of looking at the fabric behind the camera and I think I decided which colors I'm going to do first. And then I thought I was ready to cut up some fabric. Just kidding, I'm not going to cut just yet. I'll press this first. I couldn't quite get all the creases out of the fabric, so I decided to try and use a wet cloth to press the fabric because I didn't have a spray bottle handy. Now it did work, but it just wasn't an enjoyable process. So just pressing with the iron was going to be good enough. After pressing, it was finally time to cut into the fabric. However, it seemed as if I lost all my rotary cutter skills. And just trimming off the self edge took forever. And not that going slow is necessarily a bad thing, especially since I'm not quite sure if I have enough fabric to do the quilt in the size that I want to. So after doing those first couple of cuts, I need to get a little bit more organized, and I got out my trusty Miffy Post-its. And to prevent the ruler from sliding, I use my pattern weight to keep it in place. Because I needed a lot of different size squares and in different colors, I also needed more Post-its. At this point, I'm still figuring out the process and I'm trying to make it as foolproof as possible. So once I cut up the strips into smaller squares, I can make little stacks and use the Post-its to keep everything organized. So first I would cut up the fabric into long strips of the right width and then I would cut those up into smaller squares. To make the points of the star, you can either do half square triangles or flying geese. And to get the flying geese, you can make them 1 at a time or 4 at a time, and that's the method that I chose. As you're watching me sew my first block, you'll probably notice I'm not using any pins. It's not that I'm against using pins, but I find often I don't need them. So my default is to try without and adjust if I need to. You're probably going to see me do other things where you might be wondering what I'm doing, or maybe I'm doing something strange, or I forget a certain step, like winding the bobbin. But making mistakes is all part of sewing, and to me, they're often not mistakes at all. They are opportunities to try different techniques, different methods, and that is what makes sewing fun. Focusing on aligning little squares or trying a different method bring me back to the moment and get me into a flow, especially when I'm learning something new. It's almost like a little sewing game where I'm in a maze and I get to try all these directions until I find the route to the middle. But because it's all handwork, the maze will look different for me than it will look for you, because when it comes to handwork, it's so personal. If you really lean into the process, you'll find a way that works for you. And I know we're just talking about sewing here, but I've noticed that it brings me so much more than just the end result. It's an opportunity to be creative, play with beautiful fabrics and colors, and it's a way to connect with others, either about the craft itself or with the person that I'm gifting it to. Sometimes it's a collaboration. And it's a beautiful way to not just create a quilt, but to create memories. Talking about memories brings me back to one of my favorite memories of my grandmother. I had just finished knitting the Slipstravaganza, which is a shawl pattern by Stephen West. And it has all these colors and sort of zigzag patterns. It's quite big and bold. And I showed it to my grandmother and she was so excited for me and so proud. She motioned my sister to come watch my scarf, and my sister had already seen it. But just to see her light up over my knitting, it makes me so happy thinking about it. After sewing, I needed to trim the blocks to 2.5 and 4.5 inches. And you know what? I was really happy with this ruler. Once I figured out how to use it, it served me well. Now, I know I'm a beginner quilter, but my top tip for working with rotary cutters is to slide the safety cover back. With those first couple of blocks, it really felt like I stumbled through it. Luckily, there's a lot of practice and it did get better. I think I also should have put a new blade on and probably cut with a little bit more confidence. Even though I was having fun, I don't think I was having my best day, because whatever I'm putting together here is not a sawtooth block. And I didn't notice. I moved the camera, still didn't notice. Took everything to the sewing machine and still didn't notice. I did figure it out eventually, and of course it was an easy fix. But if you ever wonder if you are alone in making these silly and obvious mistakes, well, you're not. I'm making fun of myself and I always laugh at these moments, but being unable to focus and making silly mistakes was also a symptom of my mental state. I was just not doing that well and it shows. I made the choice to press the seams towards the little squares on the corner, and then for the middle part I pressed the seams towards the center square. That way I could avoid the bulky parts of the flying geese blocks. And in this case that meant I was also pressing the seams to the dark side, but if I wanted to do the same on the blocks where the colors were switched, I would be pressing the seams to the light side. I couldn't quite figure out if that was going to bite me sort of later on in the project when I would have to sew everything together, but I ended up continuing using this method for all the blocks. Maybe there's a better way of doing it, but I did not have the brain power to figure it out. I decided to just keep going. What I really liked was that the seams were nesting, so when I sewed together the block, I could feel them sort of snap into place, and it gave me the confidence to not use pins. And it's little wins like this that gave me a sense of accomplishment, positive note on an otherwise emotionally rocky day. Because I saw the presser foot pressing against the seam allowances and I was afraid of the fabric shifting, I used the thread bunny to level out the presser foot in the hopes that would prevent the fabric from shifting. I'm not sure I want to do that for all the blocks because that would take a lot of time, but it's something I'm experimenting with. That took so much longer than I thought, but now the moment of truth. The finished blocks should be 8.5 by 8.5 inches, so let's see. Oh, that looks good. Okay, I think I'm going to lose maybe a couple of points. Maybe just this one, but not bad. Now for 35 more.